This is week 9 of the college baseball rankings. Let's jump into it. So, the top 10, there's probably not going to be much movement, even though some teams didn't do very well. A lot of teams from like 10 to 20 just had an absolutely abysmal week, so not many risers in that sense. Some teams did well and were able to really capitalize on a lot of teams' poor performances, but for the most part, it was a struggle all around besides the top teams, including LSU, Wake Forest, Vandy, Florida, and Arkansas. All had great weeks. Those are the teams we had 1 through 5. And for me, they stayed in those spots. What do you think?
Yeah, also kept those five the same. Like you said, all of them had great weeks winning their series. And I went as far as keeping South Carolina in my sixth spot as well. They lost that series to Vandy, but were 2-2 on the week. And that was a hard fought series at Vandy on the road. And I think my takeaway from that weekend is that both teams are in the top echelon in the country and are both very complete teams and contenders for when Omaha comes around.
Yeah, definitely. It was a pretty good series all around. Really thought that South Carolina had Vanderbilt on the ropes after the first game, but Vanderbilt was able to turn it around and take the series, which I thought was super impressive there. So, yeah, they did. Vanderbilt did really well, but South Carolina also not a terrible week. The other teams like LSU, offense really has been carrying for them recently, with the pitching being a little bit more inconsistent. There are some injuries there, but overall, LSU still looks like one of the top dogs. Um, Wake Forest looks pretty amazing right now in the class of the ACC. Similar to LSU, they just keep passing every test that gets thrown at them.
Yep, definitely. I mean, Wake Forest winning that series against Louisville while dealing with a couple injuries in the position group is very impressive. And yeah, I mean, these all these top six teams look very impressive at this point. I thought Arkansas' sweep over Tennessee was incredibly impressive as well. And I thought that if they went 5-0 on the week and didn't drop a midweek, they could have potentially jumped over a team like Florida. It was very close, but both those teams won series at the end of the week, and it's hard to make that jump.
Yeah, definitely. I think Florida, I mean, they lost their first game against Georgia on the weekend, so it looks like maybe might have been an opening there, but they were able to close up shop for the next two games and win the series, which was good to see for them, and then didn't allow Arkansas to hop over them. But after South Carolina, I think things can get a little bit interesting of between potentially two teams. For me, it was Virginia and East Carolina that were kind of fighting for that 7 and 8 spot. I stuck with Virginia in 7, just because I think their overall resume, even though they had a down week against Pittsburgh, they lost the series, but they won a few midweeks, so that helps a bit. And East Carolina overall, I didn't think really deserved to jump a team like Virginia, but was able to capitalize on some other teams' downfall there and jump up to 8 for me.
Yeah, I think it's tough between these two. I had East Carolina in the seventh spot. Like you mentioned, I didn't think they were necessarily super deserving. I'm not convinced that they're the seventh best team in the country at this point. But also with Virginia, I think it's hard not to move a team down when you lose a series to an unranked, just average team in your conference. And so I don't know. It's tough. Like you said, Virginia does have an impressive resume altogether. I do think they are one of the better teams in the country, certainly a top 10 team at this point. I just went with East Carolina just because they had the 4-0 week. If they were
Yeah,
3-1 or something, I don't think they jump them, but I just had to move Virginia down for losing a series to an unranked, just average opponent.
for sure. I just think for me personally, why I left Virginia in this spot was because we had said previous weeks, that there was kind of a gap after that 7 spot, after Virginia, where we had teams like Stanford and Louisville and Boston College previously. There was like a gap between Virginia and the likes of those teams. So for me, I think maybe it tightens the gap between Virginia and East Carolina, but there still was that gap, and yes, I think East Carolina jumps up to right behind them, but not like overtakes them. I think just looking at overall record, competition they faced, Virginia is 31-6, and you can't really look past that. East Carolina has a little bit worse of a record, but they've done pretty well. Like you said, 4-0 on the week against decent midweek Old Dominion. The weekend series was fine. It was against Cincinnati, so good look to sweep there. But yeah, definitely a team that you should be beating for the most part. But yeah, I just thought Virginia just holds on to that 7th spot for me.
Yeah, I'm fine with keeping them there at the end of the day. I do agree that with your statement that previously we had said there was a gap between Virginia and Stanford there after that 7th spot. So I'm fine with keeping Virginia here.
Sweet. So we have the top 8 set, and after that, I kept Louisville at 9, where we had them last week. Even though they went 2-2, they won their midweek and then faced number 2 Wake Forest, lost the series there. So it was a test for them, and I don't think they passed it with the most success. They're only taking 1 game against Wake Forest, but not terrible. They still were able to salvage the series there by winning on Sunday. So getting 1 win is, I guess, what you might expect, even though it was at home. So, would have liked to see a little bit more fight out of Louisville, especially since you mentioned that Wake Forest was dealing with a little bit of injuries, but Wake Forest has shown to be the class of the conference at this point, so it's not like a huge disappointment that Louisville lost the series there.
Agree there. Also had Louisville in that spot. I think a 2-2 week is what you expected headed into this week. Like you said, didn't pass with flying colors or anything, but Wake Forest is one of the best teams in the country and one of the favorites to make it to Omaha. So don't expect them to win that series. And it was just an all right week, and they're taking advantage of teams behind them not playing that well either and just staying in this spot for me.
Yeah, and similarly, I left Stanford in the top 10, only dropping down 2 spots from last week. They went 2-3, so not a great week, but they faced Texas Tech 2 games in the midweek and then went to Oregon. Both those teams were ranked, so a really difficult week, I'd say, all around, having 5 games and all of them being against good competition. So, a 3-2 record, you're probably looking at and you're saying, wow, that was a pretty good week considering all things considered with the competition, but I don't think 2-3 is necessarily that disappointing. But yeah, Stanford was able to get 1 game out of Oregon after it looks like they were on the ropes there after losing the first 2 games, and the offense really couldn't do anything against Oregon's 2 starters there. But yeah, they finally got enough to win game 3. So not terrible, and there weren't enough teams to really jump past Stanford at this spot for me.
Yeah, I also had Stanford in this spot. Like you said, tough competition the whole week. And yeah, would have liked to see them go 3-2, but both you and I have said throughout this year that we haven't really been convinced with this Stanford team so far. Just haven't necessarily looked the part. They have an incredible roster and position player group, but just really haven't lived up to expectations necessarily. But they were able to salvage the series with a Sunday win, not getting swept on the road there, and 2-3 weeks, not the worst thing with the level of competition they were playing. And similar to Louisville, just took advantage of a lot of teams behind them not doing that well either, and were able to stay in the top 10.
Yeah, definitely. Stanford, super talented team, top 3 preseason for a lot of polls. So, they're a little bit further down now, but they can turn it around really quick if the bat gets hot at the right time. So after Stanford, I went with Campbell, who we had at 14 last week. Even though they only went 3-2, not super impressive, being 1 game over 500 on the week, but they had a midweek 2 game set against Coastal Carolina where they went 1-1. So it's kind of a good test of kind of mid-major competition, and then won the series at Longwood. So kind of what you expect, decent week, good midweek games. And going 3-2 is enough to jump a lot of these teams this week. So yeah, did all right.
Yep. Also had Campbell in this spot. Like you mentioned, good midweek competition. Would have been nice to see them pick up a sweep over Longwood, but with the way other teams played, a 3-2 week was fine to be able to move up a couple spots here. And yeah, I also had them in this 11 spot here.
Sweet. And after 11, I think it is where everything gets extremely difficult. There are teams that don't deserve to stay in their spot or potentially go up that might be looking at that this week, even after having like a losing record or going 2-2 or something like that. And a lot of teams like around 20 to 25 did relatively well, but that 10 to 20 range, a lot of teams doing extremely poorly or just average. So it was a really weird week to kind of judge the caliber of competition for some teams and just overall how their record ended up. So for me, 12 is Kentucky, even though we had them at 13 last week. Just some of the teams right above them had bad weeks and consistently for the past few weeks have looked bad, like Boston College and Tennessee. So that's why Kentucky happened to be able to jump up this week. For me, even though they went 1-2, they did go to LSU and take one game, and it looked relatively competitive. So not a terrible week for them. This is one of their like first big tests, so it's good to see that they didn't completely fail it. And I think that's kind of what you not necessarily want to see, but it's not the worst look.
Yeah, I've also had Kentucky in this spot here. Very weird to be moving a team up a spot for losing a series, but this is another one similar to that South Carolina and Vandy series where I walk away from it thinking that both teams are very solid, and it was on the road. They got torched in that Friday game, but I was impressed by them bouncing back and winning on Saturday. And then they did have a lead for a bit of that Sunday game as well and just lost it in the last third of that game. So overall, I thought it was a pretty impressive weekend. I thought they put together a pretty solid performance, and just tough when you're playing number one team in the country on the road.
Yeah, definitely. All right, at 13, things get very complicated with a lot of teams around this spot just playing poor. Like UNC, who we had at 15 last week, went 2-2. So you look at that on paper with a lot of these teams around here only getting one win or going as well like 500 on the week, something like that, and you're saying not too bad, but their midweek win was against Queens, which is just like a write-off, and then they lost the weekend series to Miami, who finally is able to get a weekend win on the road against good competition, so they're finally able to kind of get that bugaboo out of the way. But yeah, it's not the best look, and other teams like Texas, Coastal Carolina, Texas Tech all had relatively good weeks, 3-2 against good competition, and could be looking to jump up a lot here. So I went at 13 with Texas. We had them at 19 last week, but like I mentioned, 3-2, went 1-1 midweek against Texas State, so pretty good competition there, and then won the weekend series at Baylor. So 3-2 is just like, I don't know, kind of what you expect. Maybe 4-1 would have been a great look for them. It would have been a really good week, all things considered, but 3-2 isn't bad. So a lot of these teams around this area dropped off a lot. I guess I'll mention some teams that really had poor weeks, like Florida Gulf Coast went 1-3, lost their midweek to FAU, and then lost at Eastern Kentucky the series there. And then Oklahoma State also 1-3, lost their midweek against Oral Roberts, and then lost the weekend series versus Virginia or West Virginia, where all of those games were at home. So really poor there. And yeah, so there was a lot of opportunity to jump up, but no teams really are exciting to really boost up there. So for me, 13 Texas, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, this is tough. Like you mentioned, it's hard to like punish teams here without jumping teams up kind of abnormal amount of spots for just like average weeks. And so I actually left Boston College at 13 here, only dropping them 3 spots from 10 last week. They were 3-2 on the week, but it wasn't that great of a week. They lost the series to Duke, who does seem to be trending in the right direction, but not a team we've really had in our like fringe top 25 list up to this point. I think they might be cracking into that soon, potentially, but not a team that's been there. And it just wasn't that great of a week, but it was 3-2. And I didn't want to jump these teams behind them up above them because I do think Boston College has a lot of good wins on their resume. and they have played tough competition. So I left them here. I had Texas in my 15th spot, did have them jumping up a bit from where they were previously. And in the 14th spot, I had North Carolina moving up one spot with a 2-2 week. I think they've gone 2-2 3 weeks in a row now. So it's kind of frustrating watching them. I do think they're a good team. But this week alone, I did think was a pretty solid week from them. It was against Miami, who's solid competition. And if I recall correctly, I think all three games were one-run games. So it was close competition, and it was just a very competitive weekend. It's not like they got torched and lost the series in bad fashion. So I kind of felt comfortable leaving them here, although I am frustrated watching them that they've had 3 weeks in a row at 2-2 when they shouldn't.
Yeah, I think it's tough to leave them in the same spot or have them go up there, for that reason of them going 2-2, and for them being the one team that seems to not be able to beat Miami when they're on the road. So I think that's like not a great look considering that they're supposed to be around all these other good ACC teams that we mentioned previously, but they're like the one team that wasn't able to do it against Miami, even though it was a bunch of close games. But yeah, I had them dropping to 18 here. I had Boston College dropping to 17. I think, yeah, maybe I was a little harsh on Boston College here, but it is back-to-back weekend series losses. Even though they went 3-2 on the week, they're losing the most important games, which is the obviously conference series games. And Duke, yeah, like you mentioned, good. Looking like they're trending in the right direction. Seem to be pretty good, but they do have some injuries, so definitely should have been able to capitalize. And Boston College does have some quality wins, but now back-to-back weeks where they haven't looked the best, and I think they're definitely trending down, and they need to right that ship pretty quickly. A lot of these other teams that are dropping on my list a lot are teams that have recently not done very well, so I think you kind of have to look at that as like teams like North Carolina and Boston College also as kind of in that group, maybe not dropping as far, but definitely teams that are not going in the right direction right now. So I think North Carolina should be around like 16 to 18, maybe Boston College a little bit higher. But yeah, I think there's definitely a debate between teams like Texas, Coastal Carolina, and Texas Tech jumping both those teams. But now it's just kind of figuring out the order around there. I also have Oregon State in around that area, but maybe I was a little bit too high on them potentially. But yeah, I think Texas, Coastal Carolina, and Texas Tech all have very warranted positions to kind of jump teams like Boston College and North Carolina potentially.
I think it sounds like we have the same group of teams from like 13 through 17 here, just a matter
Yeah,
of kind of
figuring out.
hashing it out.
Yep, definitely. So what tech? Let's just go through the teams that we kind of haven't talked about yet. So we got Texas, went 3-2 on the week, or I guess we mentioned Texas, but Coastal Carolina, 3-2 as well. They went to number 14 Campbell, like we mentioned previously, went 1-1 against them, and then went to Old Dominion and won the series there. So I think that's actually really impressive. This is probably one of their toughest weeks of the year, and they did pretty well. They went 3-2, not amazing, not super impressive, but went against good teams and got a winning record out of it. So that's what you want to see from them. And similarly with Texas Tech, they went 3-2 as well, and they went to number 8 Stanford, went 1-1, and then to Oklahoma and won the series there. So also a pretty impressive 3-2, if I have to say so myself. So all these teams, even though they went barely above 500, it was pretty good weeks because they faced good competition.
Yeah, I would agree that both Coastal and Texas Tech were pretty impressive weeks given those midweek competitions they had. Um, yeah, this is tough to sort out. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
I also have Oregon State on the end there contending with how far to drop UCLA for having a bad 2-2 week.
Yeah. They we haven't mentioned UCLA, but we had them at 17 last week. They went 2-2. They lost at Pepperdine midweek and then won the series versus UC Davis, but I think UC Davis isn't But none of those teams are really great competition, so you would like to see at least a 3-1. So yeah, kind of disappointing to go 2-2 there. But yeah, for me, I had Oregon State jumping UCLA, but yeah, it was just a kind of string of Pac-12 teams around that 20 spot. But yeah, I think we have right above that a difficult discussion where I think North Carolina probably ends up on the back end of kind of the teams that we discussed, but Boston College maybe fits somewhere in there. I'm not sure. I don't know if necessarily 13 is the spot for them at the top of that, or they drop to 14 or 15. It's just a decision of where to separate things.
How do you like Texas, Boston College, Coastal to start it off?
Yeah, I think that works. That works for me. So Texas at 13, Boston College 14, Coastal 15. All right, and then the two other teams that we have around this were Texas Tech and North Carolina. I'd like to reward Texas Tech for facing it good competition, at least midweek wise, and all games on the road going 3-2 against relatively good teams. And road games are always going to be more difficult. And North Carolina 3 weeks 2-2. It's not great overall. 6-6 in the past 3 weeks. So been a few iffy weeks in a row, which I don't think you should look at lightly there with Boston College. They've had 2 bad weeks in a row. Now North Carolina with potentially 3, even though they were able to win the weekends the other weeks. This one they dropped. So yeah, maybe a little bit more harsh here than previously.
Yeah, we can go Texas Tech, UNC, 16-17.
Sweet, that works. And then 18 through 21, I have now a run of Pac-12 teams starting with Oregon State, I guess, in that 18 spot. And then from there it goes UCLA, Oregon, ASU. But yeah, what are your opinions?
I have the same first 3 there with Oregon State, UCLA, Oregon. Uh,
Sweet.
Arizona State stayed in the 24 spot for me.
Okay, I think that's reasonable. The back end is where things kind of get complicated with teams jumping in or a lot of these teams falling out. So the big fallers of the week that we have so far are Tennessee, who we still haven't mentioned. They were 12 last week. We also have Florida Gulf Coast was 16, Oklahoma State at 18. So none of those teams have yet to be mentioned. They all had pretty abysmal weeks, all of them going 1-3. Some face better competition than others, but none of them looked great. So yeah, we can go 18 Oregon State, 19 UCLA, and 20 Oregon. I want to talk about those briefly. Oregon State looked pretty amazing, went 4-0, and got the win midweek against Gonzaga, who is just facing tough competition non-conference wise. And then they swept what was a ranked USC team, which will no longer be ranked. They had them at 23. So they proved that they deserve to be ranked over these other Pac-12 teams in this area. And yeah, just all around impressive week. UCLA struggled a bit, like we mentioned, 2-2, not great week. And Oregon, who previously lost a series to UCLA, which is probably why I didn't jump them. I don't know about you. But yeah, they went 4-1, beating San Francisco twice in midweek and then winning the series against number 8 Stanford, where their pitching looked pretty good. And that's something that they have not had consistency with. So if they can start stabilizing their pitching, I think the team can be very dangerous down the stretch. But we'll have to see there because the offense has looked pretty good, but past that, it's been a little bit iffy.
Yeah, I think I also kept UCLA ahead of Oregon just given that head to head. But at this point, I would say that I think both Oregon State and Oregon are trending in the right direction, while UCLA seems to be stumbling, even this past week, winning the series. But 2-2 against subpar competitions, just not really what you want to see from that team. It's a very talented squad, especially on the mound. And I think you'd like to see them be picking up more wins than they have the last couple weeks. And I had those 3 there. The couple teams you mentioned, USC, obviously dropping out of my rankings. And then I also had Florida Gulf Coast dropping out of my rankings as well. Um, Oklahoma State and Tennessee hung in there for me, which left me with two newcomers, both in the 21 and 22 spots. In the 21 spot, I had UTSA finally jumping in the rankings. They've been a team that's been on our fringe for a while, and they finally faced some solid competition in the midweek, picking up a win against Texas A&M, and had a fine series win. They swept Middle Tennessee State. That's not that impressive, but I did think the midweek over Texas A&M was good, and I mean, just a team that doesn't play tough competition week after week. So I felt like this was kind of the opportunity to insert them in the rankings and reward them for consistently winning series throughout this season so far.
Yeah, I also dropped Florida Gulf Coast, and yeah, that left Tennessee in, but I also dropped out Oklahoma State. So I had three openings. UTSA did take one of those spots, so we have that in common. But yeah, I think the order we'll discuss later. But yeah, the other teams that I jumped in were UConn and bringing back Miami for like back to back to back to back weeks. It's in and out for Miami. They finally proved it on the road, so I guess they deserve that. And the main reason why I brought Miami back in was kind of a flip flop with Oklahoma State. I wasn't sure whether or not to take out Oklahoma State or leave them in, but I thought Miami overall, they have very similar records. Miami's 22 and 13, while Oklahoma State is 24 and 13. And I think Miami's just faced all around better competition, and they've kind of proved it a little bit more. And Oklahoma State's stumbling. They, even though they faced good competition this week, lost midweek to Oral Roberts and then lost the series versus West Virginia. And so at this point, with 13 losses, I don't think it really warrants being in the top 25 for a team that hasn't been looking amazing. I know Tennessee also has 13 losses, so does Miami, but they faced better competition week in, week out for me personally.
I think this was a very tough spot at the end. I also had UConn jumping in. That's who I had in my 22 spot. I thought that was actually an impressive win, series win over Xavier, who's been playing very well throughout conference play and through the end of non-conference play. So I thought that was impressive series win, about as good of a series win as you're going to see in the Big East for baseball. And
yeah, we've been holding out. We've been holding out on UConn for a while there, just waiting for them to get enough confidence in them to be able to have them jump in, with a lot of other rankings having them in the top 25 for a while now. They finally got that relatively quality series win, and now their RPI is at 14. So I mean, it's very surprising that they're that high, but you can't really look past it.
And Miami was a team I was considering jumping in. I just didn't because they got swept last week, and it's just one of those things where we've said it before. We hate bouncing teams in and out, just letting them come back in after winning one series after just losing a series. And I specifically left them out because they were swept the weekend before. I just didn't feel ready to jump them back in. And yeah, it wasn't a great week for Oklahoma State. It was pretty disappointing, but West Virginia is a team we've had on the fringe of our top 25 before, so it wasn't the worst series lost, although it was a bad week. It was to a pretty quality opponent, and I just felt like giving them the benefit of the doubt for this week rather than jumping in a Miami team that is hard to say deserving of it, but they did have an impressive week.
Yeah, it's tough. I just think overall the resume for Miami is a little bit better, but it was definitely a discussion that I had with myself between Oklahoma State, because at first I just thought, put them at the back end of the top 25, but when I really thought about it and looked more into kind of what their schedule is like, and I don't know, just seems like Miami, even though they've been inconsistent, has, faced good competition, and that's why they're inconsistent, so it's tough to have them fall in, fall out, jump back in, who knows. But yeah, I think it's definitely up for debate there. But we can, I guess, figure out the rest of the rankings besides that. Yeah, we have a few teams left to put in there. I mean, we have Arizona State, UConn, UTSA and Tennessee as 4 teams that we're not debating about. Those are all teams that we both have in. And then so there's just Miami versus Oklahoma State as the last contending team.
I just left Arizona State in the 24 spot because it was a very average week. They only played 2 games of their weekend series and they split it with UW. Didn't feel like they should be rewarded by moving up at all for just having that 2-1 week with a 1-1 split.
Sure.
And didn't really feel like they should drop it all either. So
Yeah.
I left them in the 24 spot, and my 25 spot was Tennessee, who has an abysmal SEC record right now. Although it's been against very tough competition, I think they're 5-10 in conference play now, and just the overall record isn't that much better than a lot of teams in like this 15 through like 30 range either. So they just look like a very average team right now. Even though the talent on that roster is absurd, specifically on the pitching staff, but they just haven't lived up to expectations at some point. And I don't know, it's kind of hard to finding that mix of expectations versus reality. And the reality is right now that they're just not playing well.
Yeah, the potential is just keeping them in the top 25 or at least a lot higher than they should be previous weeks. And now they're finally dropping down a lot. But yeah, I think there is a debate between like the Miami, Tennessee, Oklahoma State, those kind of teams at like 24, 25. I think ASU potentially goes up a little bit. Yeah, like you mentioned, they only went 1-1 on the weekend, but they did go 2-1 overall. Went to GCU and won the game there in pretty dominant fashion, if I recall. And then they went to Washington, so it's still a road series against a decent Pac-12 team. So, a 1-1 split isn't a bad result. It would have been great to see that next game. Probably would have either been a big jump from them if they were able to win that game, or they're out of the top 25 if they lose that. So a big difference between what happens there, depending. But I still think it's going 2-1 on the week is a good week where you could potentially stay above some of the teams jumping in. So I had Arizona State at 21, but maybe we jump one of the newcomers ahead of them, but I don't think necessarily all of them jump over them. But
I think maybe we go UConn there just because it's a team we've been more hesitant on putting in, but has been in other rankings and seems pretty deserving. They finally got that quality series win, so I say we just reward them a little extra, put them in that 21 spot.
Yeah, that works for me, and then I feel good having like Arizona State at 22. And then UTSA after that, but then it's a decision between the last 2 spots. 24 and 25, we have 3 teams for 2 spots. Those 3 teams, Oklahoma State, Tennessee, and the team that was out last week, Miami. Not super certain if we bring Miami in, even though it was the team that I thought, has a better overall kind of look than Oklahoma State at this point, with very similar records against better competition for the most part. But yeah, I think they have looked probably a little bit less consistent than Oklahoma State has. So it's either take one for one reason or the other for a completely different thing. But Tennessee, I think if we leave Oklahoma State in, I think we probably have Oklahoma State at 25 just because they had a pretty similarly bad week to Tennessee. And Tennessee was ranked a lot higher than them previously. So I think we would go Tennessee, Oklahoma State for 24-25. But if we bring Miami in, there might be a different debate there.
I think that'd be my suggestion as well, is going Tennessee 24, Oklahoma State 25. And I think Miami's one of those teams right now where if they have another impressive weekend or two, they're a team that jumps up the rankings more than a team normally would that is entering the rankings. So I think that's the benefit of keeping them out here, is just one of those teams that you can move up more freely in the upcoming weeks if they do continue to win games and become consistent rather than just flip-flopping in and out.
Yeah, I think that they've proven that they can beat good teams. It's just if they can consistently just put up normal kind of records week in, week out, which they haven't proven. So yeah, I think that's fine, leaving them at like a 26 spot. Other teams right outside the rankings for me were I guess Maryland. Even though they went 2-2, they're still kind of a fringe like 30-35 spot probably. we have DBU, who went 4-0 this past week, beat Baylor midweek, and swept at FAU. So very hot right now, 10 straight wins, and I think they're very close to being ranked, maybe behind Southern Miss, just because Southern Miss swept them. Southern Miss also had a good week. Their record is a little bit worse than DBU, but they did sweep them. So this week 3-1, lost to Alabama midweek, and then swept James Madison. Would have loved to see Southern Miss beat Alabama, and they could have been in the rankings potentially if that happened for me, but that didn't happen. Other teams for me, we got West Virginia and NC State. West Virginia had an okay week. Like we mentioned, they did beat Oklahoma State on the road, so that was impressive, but lost to Penn State midweek. And then NC State showing that they can beat bad teams, going 4-0. They swept FSU on the weekend, but they haven't proven it against good teams. Every good competition they faced, they've lost. So it's like the bad side of Miami, I'd say, where Miami has that upside where they can beat good teams sometimes. NC State just hasn't proven that, even though their record might be a little bit better.
Yeah, all those teams are in consideration for me as well. A couple more that you didn't mention. One of them I mentioned earlier was Duke, just starting to get things going in the right direction. Don't think they're like right there knocking on the door, but I do think they're entering this conversation as a team to look out for moving forward. Another one that didn't have a great week this past week, TCU, but a team that just has that quality of schedule, has played a tough schedule, has done decently well. So I think they just hang around in this area for the time being. And one more is a team that we had ranked pretty highly coming into the season. Started out very poorly in ACC play, but are also starting to get things going back in the right direction, is Virginia Tech. I think that team is very talented, and they're almost 500 in conference play now. So if they keep things up, start trending in the right direction, I think that's a dangerous team moving forward.
Yep, definitely. Sweet. Those are the teams in consideration. And now we will run through the top 25 once and for all. The top 25 of college baseball for Week 9 is Oklahoma State at 25, then Tennessee, UTSA, Arizona State, UConn, Oregon at 20, UCLA, Oregon State, North Carolina, Texas Tech, Coastal Carolina at 15, Boston College, Texas, Kentucky, Campbell, Stanford at 10, Louisville at 9, East Carolina 8, Virginia at 7, South Carolina 6, Arkansas 5, Florida 4, Vanderbilt 3, Wake Forest 2, and LSU still at that number 1 spot.